remind me. What I want to start with is saying what a joy and honor it is to give this time our lecture. It is families who are bound to culture and history that sustain cultures. And I express that gratitude not just personally, but generally in reflections on culture. Today you're going to have a lecture from me, qua philosopher. That means it's going to be quite boring. I will try to make it less boring by telling a joke. There's only one joke that I tell in public, so if anyone has ever heard me speak before, it's the same old joke. In warning, those who are physicians or medical students will remember that John Hewlings Jackson, whom the British consider to be the father of neurology and the Americans of the father of British neurology, said that there were two kinds of people incapable of humor, the insane and philosophers. So the joke is not meant to be funny, but simply instructive. It deals, the joke is set in those terrible, terrible days when oil was selling unnaturally below $100 a barrel. There is supposedly in the Humanities Library in Austin a hand-scrawled note by Thomas Aquinas, who died on the way to the Second Council of Leon of most impious memory, but where he argued that it was an unnatural act to sell oil under $100 a barrel. It's in ducats. It took a lot of... But the joke takes place when oil was selling at $9 a barrel at the Maine University of Texas, and it involves a beginning freshman course in the fall of these dark and terrible times. And a young woman who'd finished her PhD at Harvard, done a 2-year postdoctoral in physics in Geneva, and had gotten an appointment as assistant professor of physics at the Maine University of Texas, was beginning her career. And she had a large auditorium full of students, more or less like here, but not at noon, but at 8 o'clock in the morning. The lecture, since she was at the bottom of the totem pole, was for the unwashed. That is, people who had no interest in physics whatsoever, but were taking it because of some requirement, degree requirements, or some thought it might advance that possibility of getting into medical school. And in this large auditorium, there was a good old boy from Liberty County, Texas. Well, when the course came to the end, the professor, wanting to have an easy exam to mark, simply asked, how, armed with a barometer, could you determine the height of a tall building? Now, she presumed that the students would appeal to the laws of the compressions of gases, and most of them did, and most of them did it all poorly, and what shows she gave to them C's and D's. But the good old boy from Liberty County said, what I'd do is I'd tie a string around the barometer, and I'd go to the top of the building, and I'd let it off until I no longer felt the tug of Newton's force. And I'd mark it, then I'd go down and I'd pace off the length of that string, and that's how I determined the height of the tall building. Well, the professor was nearly apoplectic with rage, but just before she put the grade into the eternity of the computer, she was moved by eleemosynary passions, called the student to her presence and said, look, this is a science course. We'd expect more mathematical calculation than just pacing off the length of a string. He said, well, Professor, you should have told me this. As I'm telling you now. I said, okay, okay. I'd wait for a sunny day. What would you do on a sunny day? I'd put out the barometer. I'd measure the length of the shadow cast by the barometer and by the building, and knowing the height of the barometer and the law of simple proportions, I'd calculate the height of your building. She nearly is ready to throttle him. Said, look, anybody who's had high school trigonometry could do that. Got to appeal to some law of physics of the world. He said, well, you should have told me that. I'd go to the top of the building at once. I'd take the barometer. I'd take out my watch. I'd drop it, and I'd time it in 1/2 st squared with some side calculations with wind velocity. I'd calculate the height. She nearly lost it. She said, look, if we had enough money for students to throw expensive instruments off the top of buildings, I wouldn't be talking to the likes of you, and I have a teaching assistant. Bear in mind, it's an expensive instrument. He said, yes, yes. Well, what would you do? I'd go to the basement. What would you do in the basement? I'd look for the janitor. What would you do with the janitor? I'd go up to him and say, sir, this is an expensive instrument, and it's yours if you'll tell me the height of the building. Now, all public policy and all morality is like the joke. It depends, all the answers that we offer, depend upon what one's basic premises are and what's one's rules of evidence. What I'm going to do is to work as a geographer of morality and point out we don't agree about much, and there are good reasons why we don't agree about much, and there's very good reasons to hold that there are no sound arguments for resolving the moral disputes we have. Now, I don't mean to conclude from that we can't govern society. You all are Americans. I'm a Texan. When the fathers of my country brought my country into existence in 1836, we were mostly unchurched. Only 1 out of every 8 Texans had ever darkened the door of a synagogue or church. And they were after the French Revolution, and they understood all the hopes to find and reason a common morality for human beings that led to the bloodshed of the French Revolution and Napoleon's expansion. So they were, humans are really sinful, harmful people. What very limited democracies do is allow people who don't agree about much to cooperate in limited areas. So the default strategy is Texas. Now, for those who are going to go to sleep or wake up and come back to consciousness off and on, here, let us go through the libretto. Pick up the first page, and it starts off, and it says, Bioethics, the genesis and foundations critically re-examined. What I'm going to particularly argue is that the way in which bioethics came into existence was as a late Enlightenment hope to discover a common morality upon which we could have a common bioethics. And I'm going to tell you, hey, that isn't so, and as a final example of why we'll disagree forever about important things, I'll remind you why the debates regarding health care reform will go on forever and ever and ever, as they do all over the world. So I start off in the first paragraph, and I will read it to you. This presentation involves a geography of the moral and metaphysical controversies bearing on medicine and the biomedical sciences. Major cultural fault lines separate massively divergent moral and metaphysical views of reality, whose collision accounts for the genesis of bioethics, the gulf between its aspirations and capacities, and the persistence of foundational controversies in healthcare policy. It's to tell you that until hell freeze is over, or till Texas has snow in August, people are going to debate about the morality of abortion, euthanasia, and the proper distribution of healthcare resources. And I'm going to give a little bit of a picture of why that is the case. Look at Roman numeral 1, and I will lay out part of the debate. And part of the debate comes from the fact that, one, we defined a secular culture over against what had been the dominant Christian culture of the past, and it turned out that there is not one secular morality, but there is many secular views of justice as there are religions in the world. That's the problem. I point out, beginning in the 18th century, a gulf opened in Western European culture, separating traditional Christian cultures of an already fragmented Europe, fragmented by the Reformation, the 30 Years' War, the Civil War, from a secular post-traditional culture framed inter alia by the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, Napoleonic law. The hope was that after these great cultural wars of the 17th century, philosophers would ride to the rescue. Of those who have heard the name Immanuel Kant, Kant lived between 1724 and 1804. He had the view that morality is equivalent to rationality, so that if he had been right, philosophers would be the most important people in the universe, because we would tell you what rationality is, and therefore what morality is, and therefore what the authority of the state is. There'd be no one more important than we. That was the Enlightenment hope, and to some extent that was the hope from some people from bioethics, even of the sins of my youth, cited by Dr. Dukas. To get across that hope, let me get you to imagine 2 deputy sheriffs. It was not mentioned that amongst the sins of my youth, I was a deputy sheriff. Imagine you're drunk as skunks in a bar in England, and it is 1275. The sheriff sends me in and tells you all, hush up, y'all. And one of you said, by what authority you tell us to hush up? I said, you're stereotyping me. I went and got a PhD in theology in Paris under Thomas Aquinas of unpleasant memory. I couldn't get a job in the academy, and so I went into police work to support myself. But there are two reasons I have authority. One, authority from God. Pick out St. Paul's letter to the Romans, 13th chapter, 4th verse. It says you don't carry, and here I'd be quoting the Latin, the gladium, the sword in vain. I have the authority of God to have this gladium. Besides that, I studied Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas' commentaries on Aristotle's politics, and I can show how from a rector ratio, a right reason, I can lay out a rector ratio agibulus, and you say, heavy, heavy. The authority of both religion and reason are in concert. You hush up. Hey. Now, the second part we're moving up to is your drunken skunks, and it's in the same bar, and it's 1690. I come on in and I say, hush up, y'all. And you say, by what authority do you tell me to hush up? Now, if I pull out the Bible just after the Civil War, all the Episcopalians will go after the Presbyterians after the Episcopalians, both after the secularists, Jews, and Roman Catholics. So the last thing the deputy sheriff's going to do is pull out the Bible. I'll say again, you stereotype me. Just like John Locke, we went to Oxford. We both got PhDs in philosophy. Neither he or I could make any money in it. He went into medicine. I went into police work. But let me walk you through his second treatise on government, and you will see that you as rational persons have agreed, in fact, to the polity that has now come in with William and Mary after the great and glorious bloodless revolution. That was the Enlightenment hope, that we all shared one morality, and that morality was grounded in rationality, and the authority of the sheriff came from rationality, and when the deputy sheriff gave you an attitude adjustment, he was moving you from your heteronomous state to your real autonomous and virtuous state. Okay, I'm going to inch us up to the postmodern sheriff. Let's get out your drunken skunks at the postmodern honky-tonk on Farm to Market 306 in Comal County. Walter Fellows, who's now in his 90s, said, put on your gun, get your badge. There's a lot of noise going on. And I come out and say, hey y'all, sorry to bother you. I'm the postmodern deputy sheriff. I don't know what virtue is or what the good is, but is anybody doing anything to anyone without their permission? Say, oh no, we're doing these horrible things as consenting adults. I say, okay, sorry. Okay. Postmodernity and the salience of informed consent and the place of democracies and free markets play a role when people don't agree about much. One can make contracts with, one can come to consensual agreements with, one can trade with people with whom one has no view of the good in common. Now look at Roman numeral 2. I point out some of the things that gave a distance between the traditional Christian morality that was in Europe before all of the major disruptive events of the Reformation, the 30 Years' War, the Civil War, the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, which led to a gulf between the traditional mores of the West and those that various secularists of different sorts embraced. Realize there's not one view of morality. Anyone who's ever lived in a philosophy department and talked to the people who work in moral theory will find out that there are more moralities than moral theorists, because most moral theorists are of 2 or 3 minds about any substantive issue in philosophy. So what you see under Roman numeral 2a is that postmoderns are the inheritors of a number of intellectual developments that have led to, one, the moralization of religion. It's Immanuel Kant. It doesn't matter what religion you belong to as long as you're a good man. Pure Kant. 2, the detheologization of religion. Religion becomes a cultural treasure, not a divine revelation. 3, cosmic disorientation. The universe is regarded as coming from nowhere, going to nowhere, and for no discernible purpose. Nietzsche. 4, tolerance becomes, I don't say you're living a miserable life. I just say, well, you know, that's different strokes for different folks. Toleration used to mean, when I was the Enlightenment sheriff, I said, your life's disgusting, but I may not shoot you. I'm tolerating you. 5, the reason is that we do not share one morality, much less one bioethics. We do not share the same settled moral judgments about when to take human life. Think about the controversies regarding abortion, capital punishment, and euthanasia. In China, there's now a planned conference in Xi'an by philosophers to attack human rights in the view that one would hold that capital punishment isn't, in fact, a right that you should have a guilty person enjoy. We disagree about how to have sexual relations. We disagree about how to distribute property. So we live in a postmodern world where about the most important things that we have for our lives, we have disagreements. So page 1 is a story of general disappointment, at least 500 years old. Now, against that backdrop, bioethics came into existence. Look at number 3, and now I'm going to explain why, I think. As an intellectual historian, bioethics became very important, and I'm going to argue bioethics emerged as the equivalent of an attempt to create a secular theology with secular chaplains. Secular theology, you'd get philosophers to tell you what was right and wrong, and then you'd have clinical philosophers, bioethicists, to go and help you with your decisions in actual life and death decisions in clinics, in IRBs. So look at 3. A number of things happened in the 20th century that created a moral vacuum which required something like bioethics. If you look at 3A, it shows the genealogy of the deconstruction of medicine as a guild. My grandfather was an ophthalmologist. My great-grandfather was sort of a general surgeon, everything in Texas. So we've been practicing medicine for a while in Texas. When I was a young boy, because I'm old enough to remember when dinosaurs walked the earth, my father and grandfather's real discussion was how big of a calling card could a physician have, and, you know, how big the shingle could be outside, and the idea that anyone would have an advertisement in the Yellow Pages. Well, it was a guild, which guild enforced a whole set of canons of proper deportment, and those canons of proper deportment were to be discovered not by philosophers but by us old physicians, who had through experience understood how this profession given to us by the Greeks and the Romans should in the 20th century be maintained. What happened in 1943, there was a Supreme Court holding saying you couldn't do it without being subject to triple damages under Sherman antitrust. I only mention en passant that among not only the Medical Society of District of Columbia was involved, but Harris County, where my grandfather was an ophthalmologist and caught up in the litigation. In 1980, you see the holding that we cannot tell people how to advertise in any way that would bear on a restraint of trade, and there was also a shift from making medical decisions informed by us as physicians to having people make their own decisions as reasonable and prudent decision makers, whatever a reasonable and prudent person might be in Texas. So there was a deconstruction of medicine as a guild, and the language used by the Supreme Court is to think about medicine as a trade. Now, that's not universally the case. I spent about a month every summer in Hong Kong. Hong Kong Medical Association is like it was when my granddaddy was alive. If you put up a shingle that's too big, you're going to be no longer practicing medicine in Hong Kong, and you're sure not going to take out an advertisement in the Yellow Pages. So other people have taken different views. People in Hong Kong are trying their very best to stop individuals from making medical decisions and have the family make decisions, because they understand that the real locus of a person's well-being is within their family, and only poor Americans and Europeans struck by ennui have to make decisions on their own rather than me have my wife make my decisions, guided by my son-in-laws. So there rose in America, not uniquely all over the world, a vacuum created in part by the deconstruction of medicine from a guild to a trade. At the same time, American society was secularized. America up until the 1950s, Supreme Court holdings held that Christianity, they meant Protestant Christianity except for New Orleans, where they meant Roman Catholicism, made part of the common law of the United States. A radically different secular America develops between the 50s and the 70s. When dinosaurs walked the earth and beyond the statute of limitations. I come from a dysfunctional family. My brother's a lawyer, my sister-in-law is a lawyer. I delivered babies in Charity Hospital. I mean, they're all, their chance to sue me is gone. But Charity Hospital was run by the state of Louisiana. It was a state hospital administered by the Sisters of Charity. And when I went out to deliver my first baby, I was explained, atheist, whatever you are, if a baby's about to die, you're going to give it a Roman Catholic baptism. No one thought that was unconstitutional. That's to say there's an immense cultural vacuum was created. One, all the old physicians were marginalized, and also all the priests, ministers, and rabbis were marginalized, and a great cultural vacuum came into existence, and you needed somebody who could, with some seriousness and credibility, pontificate. Now we're down to 3C. So as these traditional sources of guidance were marginalized, medicine and the biomedical sciences have become dramatically effective and influential scientifically, academically. The medical industrial complex had risen, asking questions about the expenditures for health care, what costs could be legitimately contained. A whole set of medical moral questions came to the fore, and the usual people to answer it were gone. People needed something called bioethics. Now, looking down, Roman numeral 3D, the term bioethics itself, and here you've got to realize anybody who's had sleep disturbance and has bought one of my books so as to go to sleep easily, will notice I have long, long footnotes. We're about to go into one. And also, you know, he said his 3 books of note. Now, I published other books. Now, afterwards, I'm going to ask him why he didn't think about those books of being of note. But bad. Okay, look at down 2D. The term bioethics is about 80 years old. It's coined by Fritz Jahr in Deutschland sogar. It was really a kind of an ethos of how to relate to plants and animals. It was recaptured again by Van Rensselaer Potter. But Andre Helligers and Leroy Walters claim independently to have coined it to mean what we mean now. And if you look at E, bioethics emerged to fill an important cultural and moral vacuum as the traditional moral governance of the medical profession was brought into question. Traditional societal norms were under assault. The authority of individuals gained salience over that of medical professionals, and society's religious theological framework were privatized and marginalized, challenging the moral authority of priests, ministers, and rabbis, with the result that society as a whole, government bodies, hospitals, healthcare professionals, patients, and their families desperately needed moral guidance as to how properly to engage the promises of medicine and biomedical sciences. Reading on, F3, in case y'all can't understand my English. English is my third language. Deutsch ist doch meine erste Sprache. Ich bin ein ausgebeuteter Koloniemensch, then Texan and in English, so read F. Bioethics was engendered to fill this cultural and moral vacuum on 2 levels. One, it needed to produce the secular equivalent of a theology. It was needed to provide cultural orientation. Bioethics was needed to secure an intellectual framework for intellectual guidance, as well as a foundation for secular culture and its law and public policy. Think yourself back to the 70s. All the usual people had been marginalized. More important than Tuskegee was Roe versus Wade for the President's Commission. A whole bunch of traditional values were challenged, and people said, well, how do we find our way in this new, very conflictual situation? And at Georgetown, people said, we'll help your way through. We philosophers are always ready to guide the republic as long as we can become kings, at least paid by kings, at least live like kings. F2, you also need the secular equivalent of a cadre of priests and chaplains need to be culturally ordained, authorized, to provide bioethics consultations, serve on ethics committees, etc. Roman numeral 4. To confess, you can see how very strong I am. Look, I'm one of the few people you'll ever see who's actually done push-ups with Arnold Schwarzenegger. It's true. I won't say who did best, but I spent a long time at Georgetown University and was there sort of bioethics took shape. And as I point out, it is probably no accident that bioethics, encompassing both scholarly endeavors, the first encyclopedia of bioethics came out through Georgetown in 1978, and total immersion courses, here the quasi-religious metaphor, were established to create the new secular chaplains, had its roots in a Roman Catholic institution, Georgetown, which possessed traditional commitments to the universal claims of natural law, which natural law concerns, albeit in transformed fashions, continued in certain elements of the Enlightenment and contemporary concerns about the universality of substantive moral claims about human rights and human dignity. A, the contemporary complex field of bioethics emerged as, one, a scholarly discipline, that is, an unapplied field to provide intellectual direction, and two, a clinical praxis, an applied field, where paradoxically, clinical bioethicists infrequently give normative moral advice. That is, though they are intellectually ordained, they rarely ever do ethics. Instead, they usually provide legal advice without being admitted to the bar, a point brought up to me by my brother and son-in-law. I was on the bioethics committee of a number of very large hospitals in the Texas Medical Center. Most of the people, both physicians, nurses, and patients, just want to know what the law is. If I began to give them a lecture on ethics, they'd say, you know, Pastor, I want to know about the law. So I practiced law without a medicine, law without being admitted to the bar, to mediate conflicts and to clarify concepts and analyze arguments, but not come down and give them my view. B, the core moral disputes regarding matters of life and death, and here's the rub, from abortion to euthanasia, remain as points of cultural conflict, thus placing bioethics at the center of the culture wars. As with the secular revolution of the Enlightenment, so too with regard to bioethics, the hopes for uniformity of moral vision have gone aground on an intractability of moral pluralism. If you don't believe this, just look at the political campaigns. How many different views there are about abortion, homosexual marriages, healthcare distribution. Nobody much agrees about anything. Everybody's trying to jockey for their own secular congregation. Bioethics is a battleground in the cultural wars because bioethical concerns define major dimensions and passages of life. The controversies are interminable in the absence of common premises and rules of evidence. Despite the failure of the Enlightenment aspirations, there are nevertheless passionate statements with regarding consensus. I recommend to you the UNESCO Universal Declaration of Bioethics, which is one of the most vacuous statements I've ever read amongst a sea of very vacuous statements. And since I know the person who actually wrote it and what she actually thinks of it, and this man is still recording, I can only suggest what her judgment was of the thing. 5. Now I'm going to remind you, by taking a real quick case example of health policy, why we'll never agree about health care reform. And the reason is that people generally want something that's impossible. That is 5A. They want the best of care, equal care, physician-patient choice with cost containment. You have to be crazy, psychotic, or really caught up in an ideology to believe that could be true. The trouble why that never works in any country in the world is the very character of human finitude. Look at B. 1, all humans will die. None of us will get out of here alive. 2, most humans will suffer before they die. You have to be killed right off the bat to avoid that. 3, human resources and capacities are finite. All the resources in the world will not allow us to live as long as some of us like to live in good health. 4, medical knowledge is probabilistic. That means it's like a gamble where you put your money down. And 5, there's not one view about what justice or fairness is. There's many secular views of justice and fairness as there are major religions, so when you have a serious debate, the arguments go in a circle, engage in infinite regress, or beg the question. A healthcare system that will come to terms with reality is one that no one really wants to acknowledge. That's why everyone in the world, except for Canada and Taiwan, have a system where it's like this. 1, care that is less than the best is provided to everyone. And as you run out of money, it becomes even less best. The chance of dying of cancer of the prostate in the United States, if you're diagnosed, is 19%. In the British National Health Service, it's 57%. 13% of people diagnosed with cancer of the large bowel, all of which were operable, are inoperable by the time they finally get to an NHS surgeon. You can't have everything. Unequal care. The poor will not receive as good a care as the rich everywhere. In Canada and Taiwan, they just fly out, I hope, to Texas. 3, you have to limit physician-patient choices, and only then will you contain costs. No one likes that circumstance, and everyone tries to make an argument why it should be different, but we don't agree about the basic premises, and so the disputes go on and on. Bioethics can give us a geography of the disputes. Philosophy can tell us why we will not agree about the important issues. It can help us to help people come to terms not only with the finitude that all of us will die and all of us will suffer, but that secular philosophy cannot bring the rabbit out of the philosopher's hat and give us the one way we should look at things, and that unfortunately we will have to live with real difference. I mean, diversity in skilled color is nothing like diversity in ideology. We'll have to live with real diversity where people don't agree about the human good, human flourishing, and that's what limited democracies are about. That's why I said we'd end with Texas, Roman numeral 6. We're destined to live in the culture wars because the advocates of disparate positions in major moral and public policy controversies do not share common moral and metaphysical premises or rules of evidence. All attempts to resolve the controversies involve begging the question, arguing in a circle, or engaging in infinite regress. As a result, our culture is one of endless debates without a resolution in sight. Bioethics is irreducibly plural. Thank you very much.